Hi, my name is Marcelo Aller, and this is BioInsights. This is the podcast that will be talking about physiological data and how it relates to your health, happiness, and performance. Welcome to our podcast, and today I'm talking to Bob Alejo. He's a distinguished leader in high performance sports management and strength and conditioning. He has an impressive career that spans over decades. Bob has been a significant contributor to Major League Baseball, to the United States Olympic Committee, NCAA athletics. He's an organizational leader. He's been so nice in the NSCA. Many people have rubbed elbows with professionals before, but he's always been an individual who's given as a public speaker. He's written several articles as a practitioner. He contributes to the sports science community around athletic performance and wellness. So to get us started, I'm really excited about this. There was a recent study that Dr. Tenen presented, and it has a long title, but it really talks about real-world evidence and how we can bring communication outside of silos in an athletic environment. And I would love for you to start there because I think it'll encapsulate your journey as a career, as in your career, what you've seen in departments. So with no further ado, I hand it off to you, Bob.
Well, thanks, Marcel. I really appreciate that. And thanks for having me on. And yeah, I've done this for a while and I've seen some things and I think it really helps us to understand, where we've been to understand where we're going. But quickly, you're right, it is a long title, but it's an important title to a great paper that Matt had asked me to help him with, and who I think is a brilliant statistical practitioner as well as a PhD and an ATC. The title of that is Athlete Health and Human Performance Will Not Improve Without Transdisciplinary Collaboration and Data Sharing in Elite Sports. So, how has that transformed? I mean, really like the idea of the high performance model, but, typically there's a couple of models there that we have to look at. And in the paper, we diagram it and talk about the pluses and minuses of both. But I think the key here is the difference between transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary. That's really the place we need to start first. And the difference is interdisciplinary, just to sum it up, is really it's a team of teams, right? You got all your pods, strength and conditioning, nutrition, sports medicine, and all that. But transdisciplinary is one team. It's not a team of teams. And I think that's important to note because, we talk about silos, and even though there's a model that has these groups meeting, essentially there's nothing in place to have everybody share the information. And it's the sharing of information that makes it transdisciplinary and a soft place to land when athletic trainers and strength and conditioning coaches and nutritionists are talking about similar things, and it interacts. So we don't want to talk about, hey, here's what we're doing in strength and conditioning. It's going to be, here's what we're doing in the athlete performance and health delivery system. And so that's really the key. And I've been pushing this for a long time. I was able to implement this strategy at California State University Northridge, where I was the senior associate athletic director for student athlete health and performance. And I think that's where this model has been set up. Oftentimes they'll set the model up, but they don't have the right conductor of the orchestra. Essentially what you need to have is a manager. And that high performance manager, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, we have so many different titles today, Marcel, it's you with. But it's
Many acronyms following it too.
What's that?
There's many little acronyms following it too.
Gosh, it's awful at some point. Excuse me for just a minute.
Yeah, no, I see it all the time. It's like okay, you're repeating.
Yeah, you know what I think? I think, I'm thinking, God, maybe that's a good job, right? Because you could have a full-time job just making up job titles the way things are these days, for crying out loud. So, I think that the piece is being the conductor of the orchestra. So the way I talk about it is, it's not about telling people what to do and that you're the boss. Your job is to facilitate. So if Marcelo, you're in strength and conditioning, my job is to go to you and say, how can I make you great? What do you need to flourish? What do you need to create? How do you progress? What can we do to get the best product out the door? And I think, the conductor of an orchestra is important, but it goes further than that. I mean, I remember hearing Nick Saban talk about, getting the right people on the bus, which people talk about all the time. But he takes it one step further, and I'll give that same analogy here with the transdisciplinary model. Not only do you need to get the right people on the bus, but you got to get them in the right seats. And so for me, I want to make sure that I can help this giant orchestra put out this piece of music. And if we've seen an orchestra, I mean, is there anything that's even a better work of a team than an orchestra? I mean, we got 50, 75 pieces there performing this one sound. I mean, it's just remarkable. So the key is having them play the right music, having them sitting in the right seats, having them playing the right instruments in the right place. That's the piece. So I think what we've seen is good attempts at building this model, but we got to realize that a couple of things. One, it has to be a leadership role. And that's the thing that enacts this real world evidence, right? It's got to be a leadership role. And the second thing that's probably as important is you have to have somebody who has been a practitioner and has above average knowledge of those areas. And we don't see that enough. In fact, the overwhelming majority for years has been senior socioathletic directors or assistant general managers that oversee that area and have never done anything that we do.
Yeah.
And I would add that collegiately and perhaps professionally too, but I know collegially for sure, they don't even watch, they don't supervise, they don't see you do your job because they have 10 other tasks they have to do. Aside from the fact that, let's say they come and watch me and you work, how would they know that we're doing the right thing?
Yeah. No, it's exactly the biggest problem because now you add, the integration of not only the sports science, but technology, the data analytics into this environment, and you're seeing it impact collegiate sports, you're seeing it impact sports overall across the board. And I think there's a lot of things that we could improve on that, I just haven't seen it. I've had several conversations where I've asked like the same question in regards to the strength and conditioning space. Has it really changed? Is it still the same? Are we still seeing the same problems? Do we see technology being adopted? I just feel like we're still like it's almost like church. You're going in and your hit guys, you got your conjugated guys, you have your functional or hybrid version of it, and everyone at the end of the day is outcome driven, but there is no standard in yet the data analytics or the data or the technology they choose to use. And
Well,
that's where I'm seeing a problem.
I think I would agree with that. And, again, that the real world information in real time, when you have a good transdisciplinary model, you have me as the manager or director, however you want to term it, as the data broker, right? And that data could be just information. It could be, hey, the doctor's appointment changed from 10 to 11 today. But when you have those silos, what happens? You guys meet in the morning at 9 a.m. and then you don't meet again till either the next morning or a couple of days later at 9 a.m. Here's what we did on Friday, So when you're sitting in those meetings, you got to have somebody that's, an automated data broker, as we put it in the paper, with real-time information delivery. And that's how you get this thing to kind of move a little bit, right? But at the same time, I think even in the transdisciplinary model, even though I think it's the best performance and welfare delivery system for athletes, if you don't have the right data broker there, if you're telling me something from a rehab standpoint, from a nutritional standpoint that I don't understand or couldn't understand, how can I help you? So again, now that data is dead or it's misunderstood or it's directed in the wrong area. So, anecdotally, I think I look at some of these people who've been put in those positions. And I wonder, okay, first of all, okay, pretty good background maybe in performance, but are they a leader? Are they coming from a place of leadership? I think the best fit for the directors and managers in these positions are strength and conditioning professionals because we cross-pollinate with every bit of it. Every bit of it we tap. And we're coaches. This system works with coaches. They're part of the model, right? And so, but we work with them all the time, and so that's that's an important piece. We're working with the coaches, the athletes, and every other practitioner in that group, where those other practitioners essentially work by themselves. They may get input here and there, but how great would it be for me to help the nutritionist refine the nutritional plan for somebody who now is in a higher metabolic conditioning phase? Unbelievable,
Yeah,
right?
you're talking about the career path of that community that has not really been serviced or done right. And it's simply because it's been forced to change over a period of time. To be able now to to recruit athletes, it's even harder now, obviously with NIL and other challenges in that environment. It becomes this environment where you probably have seen it, and you started there, you went to the pros, and then you came back, and then you're describing this role. I think you mentioned to me that like you see this role kind of what you're like in your return back to baseball as an example. You're kind of in that similar, you're kind of defining the role that you're in, where you're more of the consigliere of recommendations and making sure people are supported and driven, but at the same time the individuals on the ground level have a voice and have someone there overseeing.
Well, that's what I've done. My role right now with the Angels is an assistant strength and conditioning coach. So I've stepped back a little bit in my administrative role to come in and try to help the Angels go in the right direction. I mean, I think the real key there is valuing my experience and my age and kind of some of the things I've accomplished. But I think you made a good point about everybody having a voice, because it's one team. So I don't in the normal model that I like to put, the transdisciplinary model, as the conductor, I don't mind my athletic trainer questioning why we're doing squats in the weight room. I don't mind my strength coach questioning how much protein we have in our first meal of the day. Because all of us start at the very basic educational level. We all take the same courses. It's like physicians. They all take the same courses. And at some point, they go orthopedics, they go pediatrics, they go whatever. Same thing with us. We're all taking the same course, and then it's strength and conditioning, athletic training, massage, physical therapy, nutrition. So there's smart people in the room that can ask these basic questions. I don't expect them to know the nuances of strength and conditioning. If they know those nuances better than me, then I shouldn't be doing my job. Same with an athletic trainer. If I know more about rehab and some of the preventative medicine measures they take or rehabilitate, then we need to find a new trainer. But when we see something, I'll give you an example. One of the biggest things with this model is you've got to standardize the nomenclature. You got to standardize the language. So the perfect example is a squat is a squat. With you say you're going to two-legged squat. There's got to be a certain criteria for it being a squat and for what it's not, right? So in other words, there's no such thing as a rehab squat or a strength conditioning squat. It either is a squat or it is not. So where do you think that could bungle up the message a little bit? Well, here, when you have reporting lines and responsibilities, that empowers you. That doesn't drop you down. That says, here is your part of this message. It's all yours. Nobody can give it except for you, and you're in charge of it. Has to go through you, has to go by you, has to come from you. But we're all contributing. But if we have 5 people delivering a message, you can imagine what that squat looks like if that athletic trainer that's working with you on your knee has, the flu, and somebody else has to come in and they turn that one-legged squat into who knows what, right? And so that's the other key, is clear and concise messaging, which, first of all, you got to share it. I mean, I think in the military does a great job, and I do a lot of looking on the Harvard Business Review, and they like to use the military as examples. And can you imagine having a muddied message when you're going on an attack or trying to, take over a spot? There's only one person delivering that, and the next person, the next person, the next person. So I think the standardized language is a perfect example of sharing information about, hey, that seems like an awful long time for a grade 1 ankle sprain. It's now been 6 weeks. One of those things. I think that's a good question to ask in the group. And when you get to the part where you don't, if you're miffed at somebody asking you a question, I think that the next question is, why am I miffed at somebody asking me that?
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point because I think people need to have the ability of having open discussions and not it's not a point of questioning someone. It's a point of trying to contribute to the outcome. They still are that director of their agency, but they have contributions now and roles from other people that they can get another view, another perspective of this. It only is going to make them better. And to your point, it helps them develop too, because you are right. Everyone starts out with a foundational course curriculum and understanding of it, but you're only going to get better when you're pushed to explain it or pushed to actually specialize. And then that role changes. So you've obviously started out in the strength and conditioning community where technology, wearable technology, or it was not really openly adopted, right? It was more of this system works. We're still going to be doing, Olympic lifting, or we're still going to be doing powerlifting. And, I think, in a prior conversation, we talked about how overseas their strength and conditioning performances are completely different from what we do here.
Right.
Can you talk about that role and those changes that you've seen as well?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the role, I'm not sure it's the role. I think there's a little bit to do with the culture of athletics too, that kind of influences, which it shouldn't, what you do. But I think that the role of strength and conditioning coach can be what you want it to be. I mean, how many times have we heard, and I think I'm asking your question, make sure that
You know,
how many, football is a perfect example that for years, hey, he's our most important guy. He's the biggest thing in the world, and he's making 50 grand, 80 grand, while the other coaches are making, 100, 200, 300 grand. So we used to say, like, well, he's not making very much money for being the most important guy. So it was very, very flippant and
yeah.
irresponsible for coaches to say that. So finally, as we've seen now, I mean, we got a couple of guys making $1 million a year as strength coaches for football. So when they say that, now that's happening, right? So that's a good thing. It's a good thing to be part of. We know now that availability is the best ability in athletics. I haven't used that a lot, but people do, and it's correct. And so you got to have your players ready to go and healthy. And now we know that strength and conditioning piece is only a small part of total health, right? So, it's evolved to the point where I think now that you've got to be able to understand everything a little bit, and I think every practitioner should to be good. And so I don't want to pinpoint the strength and conditioning profession specifically to understand data and data analysis and technology and rehab and return to play. Of course, they're part of all that, but so is everybody else,
Yeah.
right? And what happens is when you're not doing that, that's a problem. And again, that's that whole transdisciplinary thing.
You bring up a good point because my point was like, I feel like sometimes you introduce technology in that environment with the
Yeah,
coaches,
yeah,
and they either will leaderboard it or they will try to carrot and stick it, or they'll use something taking research and thinking that it's the future of strength and conditioning. And I mean, I did it myself in realizing that how many years I wasted, not wasted, but like I could have done better. It's like,
right,
but to your point, there's data out there, right? So it's like you have so much time, you got to be able to get these kids to be available and to perform at their proper level. But there's other people who have that same responsibility as you. And that's where I think we're seeing now people that are like assistants or specialists that are just brought on to be able to do the data analytics, to be
right,
able to get you the data. So you as a coach are looking at it from a higher level and just looking at the statistical breakdowns, the
right,
significant deviations here. It could be a Z score. It can be many, many aspects that I definitely have seen applied. I think that is kind of my point of my question to you is that
okay,
you've seen what's that was always labeled the future. Now that I'm flashing back to when I first met you, which was like the early 2000s. And we were at the NSCA show. And at that time, they were just talking about Tendo units and talking about average
Right.
velocity and talking
Right.
about velocity based training and, Louis Simmons and thousand pound squatters. And I think you were the first person to say, well, I'm not training 1,000 pound squatter. I'm training, a cleanup hitter, or I'm training a, Olympic athlete, So I think that's where I just feel like has the role is changed in that it's added almost more problems for a coach, right? Because with more money comes more problems, you know?
Yeah, that's the way it should be. That's the way I look at it for sure. Okay, so you mentioned a couple things, and I was taking some notes while you're talking. Here's how the wave happened, right? When the tech first came out, most strength coaches and were really like, I don't need that crap. I know what I can see. And, that was really an ignorant response. I mean, it shows how, unevolved we are. And there's still a bunch that do it. Well, I jumped on it right away because what it got was exactly what I wanted. I wanted more conclusiveness in what I'm doing. If you bring me closer to conclusion, right? It's the difference between having a vertec, right, that measures every half inch than a force plate that measures millimeters and centimeters, right? That brings you closer. Now, can you get by with a vertec? Well, of course you could, you know. But when they say, there's a, what 100 ways to skin a cat or 1,000 ways, I'd say, yeah, that's true, but there's only a couple of good ways, right? Same thing with, and the analogy would be driving. Like, well, I can drive to New York by going through South America. I can go all the way down and all the way down the bottom and then back up again, and eventually I'll get to New York. But there's probably a quicker way, right? Or, like, well, that's, there's a better way to, well, that works for me is kind of the general thing. That works for me. Well, are you going to do what works or are you going to do what works best? In other words, I could take 2 cans of green beans and do lateral raises, and I'm going to get an adaptation. But if I'm working on strength, there's probably a better way to do it, right? So my response to these people were, I don't need that shit. I mean, I can see this and that and the other thing, from biomechanics to vertical jumps and velocities and stopwatches, which I've never used a stopwatch, by the way. I've always used my watch. I've never held a stopwatch or a whistle, ever. So it wasn't a stance, it just happened that way. But what I would tell them was, I'd say, you know what? I'm pretty good at what I do, and I can't see that. So I know if I can't see that, I'm pretty damn sure you can't. So, I want to see exactly what it is, which is why I changed my data collection too, from averages to standard deviation and z-scores, because it brings me closer to a conclusion about groups, about my team, about individuals. And so the technology at the time that Louis and some of these guys were doing some things like that, I think the easiest thing to do for folks who, I mean, there's so many analogies here that are flying through this small little Mexican brain of mine right now. That,
Averages tend to normalize things, right? So
well, I think averages, I just go back to the flaw of averages. You know, if your average squat on your team is 200 kilos, that means you got somebody squatting 150, but you also have somebody probably doing 220 to 250. So how do you account for those two? You can't just throw them out. You just got this small little group. So I want to know, where are you in my team, right? Which also brings to a whole nother comment. Like, I don't care about that team. I can only care about this team, which is why I used to tell my soccer guys when they come to me with Premier League data, I said, we don't have a guy that could carry water onto the pitch for a Premier team. Why are we trying to get these guys to run that many meters? Let's get this group better. Data is important. Get your data from your team. The most important thing is to get that data better, not their data, not like whatever, because in the end, even that part you have to kind of take with a little grain of salt, because hey, my team now runs 21 miles an hour. Well, that's not going to help you to go against a team that runs 22. But it's important that you did that. So you got to keep these things in order. But I think when Louis and those guys, some of the advanced methods they were doing and some of the things they were doing over in the Eastern Bloc back in the day, it was easy just to dismiss them. I'm not training those guys. I don't need that. And in fact, it's super important because it's human performance. It's human performance. I think after a while, how have we come to grips with it? I'm not sure everybody has. And for sure, what we're seeing is a misuse of technology and data. So again, going back to we talked about, you got to have the right conductor, right? So it's not the tech's fault. If everybody would just sit back a minute and quit damning the technology doesn't do anything. And here's my analogy. It's like a toaster, right? If I don't plug it in, I'm not getting any toast, right? If you don't plug in the catapult box, which I've ran a million times, it does nothing. In fact, when you do plug it in and put the pucks on them, let them run around, it still does nothing. I could have my son. I remember back 10 years ago, my son's birthday was just yesterday, he's 17. But when he was 10, I'd say, thank you, I'll tell him. I'd say, run in the catapult. I said, my son can do that. He's on the computer playing whatever computer game. So if I tell him, hey, take Marcelo Aller's name and get load per minute, get all that stuff, he could do that. That's not hard.
Yeah.
The hard part is what all that
makes sense
helps you for the intervention.
Yeah.
But if you don't understand the data, if you don't understand the context, if you don't understand the numbers, it's absolutely worthless, and it's not the technology's fault. So again, let's go back to the toaster. If I burn the toast, it's not the toaster's fault. It's my fault because the toaster doesn't do anything but what you tell it to do, right? So we've seen, it's sad to think that all this injury stuff's happening across the board, right? There's more data, more tech, more analysts than ever before. And the data from injuries have not really done anything different.
No.
And whose fault is that? It's the practitioner's fault, without a doubt.
We also, it's also partially the athlete, right? What we've done to the athlete, in my opinion. We've over specialized at a younger age. These kids are already coming to us with injuries that should not be in existence at that age. Like how many college kids now come in with Tommy John or with ACL? It's like,
that's fair.
It's a combination, I feel, of that, but also getting back to your data question or data answers. It reminds me of me when I used to go into NFL or NCAA programs and talk about heart rate training and energy systems, and talking about things that help in recovery or things that actually help in health from a longevity standpoint as well, and saying, hey guys, these kids are going to be with you, but once they leave you, what are they leaving?
Right.
And I think the data side of this is definitely misunderstood, because what ends up happening, what I saw, is every time that I introduced tech, they would look at day-to-day occurrence. And I'm like, I almost forbid them for the first 2 weeks to look at data. Just download it. For the first weeks, I don't want to see. Then after that, we'll meet at the end of the month and have data review. And they were like, well, why 4 days? Because I want to show you trended data, because week to week, day to day, if you could have come to me, we got to implement the system, and we have to talk about what that system is and what we're looking at. We're collecting reference data. There's no normative data for your offensive, defensive system, for anything. This is reference data. So it takes years. So if you're going to bring sports technology in, it takes years. To your point, it's not the toaster that you got that's the problem. It is making sure that the person that's in there knows that that's bread that you should be toasting.
Right. I'm going to use that. I'm going to steal that.
I'm using the toaster analogy too. Don't worry.
Well, and I get so fed up with the talk about data and tech and all that. But I do think that part of our evolution has to be, you got to grab onto the data. I mean, when I was at NC State in the beginning, some of those guys were in football, where I brought catapult at the beginning, and then I ended up taking it for basketball. They were a little bit resistant to it. And so at some point I'm like, hey, how's it going? How's it going? And just, well, this guy, that guy. So eventually I just said, hey, look, and I think this is where I'm good at being the conductor. I say, I understand it's hard to change what you've done all the years, right? If anybody knows that, I do, right? Fortunately, I've been more right than wrong. At the same time, if you guys want to go from here to another level, if you want to become a director of strength and conditioning at the league, or you want to get to the NFL or something like that, you need to embrace it and understand it. You have to embrace it and understand it. Now, I'm not saying you have to use it, but when you go to those interviews and they say, why are you against the data? You better have a pretty damn good explanation. And so you have to embrace it no matter what. And I think that's also important, right? Just like all of us, when we're looking to get better, and I think we all are, when you find something that has perhaps created good outcomes in certain populations, but you decide not to use it in yours, I'm hoping it's not just because you don't like it. I'm hoping because you can come up with a pretty good hypothesis or conclusion that this is not going to work in my population. Doesn't, I'm not saying you have to do it. Of course, I think it's never say never, but I think it's nearly impossible not to get a job if you're not involved in data and technology.
I think a lot of it has to do with like what does a coach choose? If you have, because obviously, listen, all programs don't have the same budgets. I mean,
Right.
if I was in Alabama, I think I could write a check for anything that I want, But if I'm from, a D2 school, I don't have that budget. So like people have to adapt their strength training program for different, for different programs. Can you kind of like, I mean, you've dealt with athletes, especially from a transition from college to pro sports. How do you adapt to those different ages? I mean, because they've you've I mean, you've interacted with some Hall of Famers and you've interacted with a lot of these up and coming kids. Do you change your communication style? What do you think of today's athletes compared to, a couple of years ago?
Well, that's a big one. That's the podcast 2.0 right there. Well, I would say so. When you talk about communication, I think the communication has changed for all of us, right? Because, when I first started at UCLA in '84, no computers, no phones, right? First cell phone I bought was like this big. I felt like I felt like I was in that one of those old army movies with a field phone. And so that changes a little bit our communication because these kids have that kind of access to any Joe or Susie Blow out there that's got something to do with all the things we talk about, right? Rehab, here's how you fix your back, here's 6 easy ways to gain 10 pounds of muscle in 2 days, whatever it might be. And so I've got to fight that. It used to be kind of the same thing when I started with the A's in '93. The hardest thing wasn't to train baseball players, it was to retrain, right? That's the problem. They came to me and they're in the programs all good, right? But then when you come from another team or, like that, then you got to retrain them and explain to them why that's not the best thing or why you chose not to do that. And here's what we do instead. So, I think the communication is you better be ready to have the answers, which frankly, now that I'm thinking about it, back in the old days, which only I and a few guys can talk to is they just did what the hell you told them to do. And there was no getting around it. I mean, here's what we're doing. Get on the line, put that on the bar, come at 5 in the morning, whatever. And now that's not quite the same way, which is good. There's a lot of good with that, but not, I think that as long as you have discipline, you can't have organization unless you have discipline. And by that, I mean, structure. So it's different. It's different that way. I think the biggest difference, and I've been asked that question, but never really thought of it as deeply as I have after you gave it to me. It's changed a little bit because now you're communicating not only with them, but you're communicating with all the things they've just read and heard and seen and all that. And that's tough.
I look at it this way, like generationally, I was like, shut up and do as you're told.
Oh yeah.
I have the other generation of like now that is like, no, why? And you have to be able to explain the why
Yeah.
generation, but also motivate them. So I think this whole behavior, sports behavior, psychology to it, where in the past it was like, shut up, don't say anything, go, like it's you keep it to yourself. That was now it's almost, it's like it's talked about, which is a good thing too. Like so there's things that we've seen progress on, but we've seen also a lot of increased focus on different topics.
Yeah.
So from mental health to recovery to active rest, what are some things that you do differently now in your training programs around that?
Well, I think some of my that well, I know some of my philosophies have changed a little bit. But the good news for me is that I don't have as many theories anymore. I have examples. So I don't have to, I don't have to guess. I know what I know, and what I don't know, I'm still going to go after. Right? And I think in my career and thankfully, I can say I really don't have anything to prove anymore, but I got plenty to accomplish. I think that's the way that kind of keeps you moving. But one of the things is, my bald-headed, bespectacled,
It's a great hairstyle.
no, hold on. My bald-headed, bespectacled, worthy opponent, Mike Boyle, God love him,
You know,
right?
like the squat team.
He changed my mind about squatting 2 times a week. So, I don't squat anybody twice a week. We squat once a week, 2 legs, and the other leg day is a one-legged squat of some sort. That changed a little bit. I think my outlook over the years was, and rightly so, because we really weren't able to reach out too far, was really in the weight room, right? Really in the weight room. And then at some point it became out on the field when you're conditioning. But outside of that, I remember back in the early 80s, we didn't get any rehab. You got the guy when he was ready to go, or the woman when she was ready to go. We didn't have any part of it, which was weird. Now you think about it, like, God, that was the dumbest thing ever. But sets and reps, I'm kind of past that a little bit. I think if you can call yourself an expert at something, I think I'm pretty damn good at programming. But now what I realize is all this testing that we do, testing speed and strength and power and all this, really the biggest asset there, the biggest benefit is return to play. Now you have baseline information, and now you can bring somebody back from injury with, again, more certainty,
Yeah.
closer to certainty, right? So now I can say, here's your best squat, here's your best jump, your best run, your best whatever it is I'm testing, max VO2, your best whatever. I need 90% of that before I can clear you. So now I have a number, and then I have another number. And by the way, when you were talking earlier about some of the things that we did, because there really wasn't any technology, at the time it was happening in the physiology lab, but the force plates were as big as my room then. You couldn't transport them anywhere. But when it started talking about the era of big data, which I'm proud to say I was a part of, and that's where Billy Bean and the A's really began the whole thing. I saw it; it was there, it happened. It's the era of big data, and my question to that was always, was data ever not big? It was always big. If you were doing the right thing, the only way you could program and direct your program was through testing, evaluation, and data, right? So that's why the return to play is so, I think, more important now to me than ever. I think testing is important, but the real value of that testing is not that day. It's not that you go from 300 to 340 in the clean. It's that now you have a new baseline that I can draw upon when you're short physiologically.
You bring up a great point because it's you. I think the one thing, and I agree with you. I do like the concept of bilateral loading one day and unilateral. It makes complete sense after looking because I violated that all the time.
We all did. I got the back to prove it.
Back or knees, take your choice.
Oh,
But you bring up the most important thing I think people need to understand is you have episodic measurements and you have continuous measurements.
right. I like that.
And the episodic measurements are those baselines that you're referring to, that like to return to play or to return to life. That's where I think data is really meaningful. And that's where I feel like you're getting now devices that give you sleep data, that give you resting heart rate data. And then it's just interesting to your point. Like you get coaches that either say, well, I don't believe in it because it's their privacy, because of it's their sleep. And I'm just going, well, hold on. That answer really should not be given to someone at all publicly because I'm like, you're responsible for their recovery. You're not asking what they're doing during their sleep. You're asking what's their quality of sleep like because that impacts next day's performance in anything that they do. So it is really interesting to see like what are your views on like topics like, looking at continuous measurements and episodic measurements because you brought up looking at, your Olympic lifts or looking at
Hmm.
your vertical jump. Like jump height's definitely of something that's been continuously measured and shown to like identify performance and your type of athlete. There's no, research is there. Jump height's very important. But what are some other, I think, like, because I think everyone likes to measure everything, but which is not a bad thing, but like what have you learned through the years that are probably your rock solid episodic ones? And what are you interested in continuously looking at?
Well, I can tell you this, that it has changed very little over the last 40 years. Very little at all. I still like the clean, the squat, the bench. I think every one of those represent the best evaluation in that area physiologically and anatomically. And then you have your vertical jumps, your broad jumps. Again, I really now have switched over to shorter distances for the sprints, like 5, 10, and 20-yard sprints. So you can just take a 20-yard sprint and then take a split at the 5 and the 10 to give you an idea. And then, of course, the data, the catapult data, and all this other stuff is more practice specific. But you can also attach heart rate information and velocities there too, right? When you're doing some running. But you know what? You make a good point about, well, then of course all the other biomarkers, and the general look at calories, general look at hormonal levels and creatinine and all these other things are going to be important. That's again, when's the last time you saw that report at an athlete intake? Never. I've still haven't seen it yet.
It's
Yeah,
typically a trainer or a sports medicine doctor.
yeah.
It's not
That's important for us to know, right?
yeah.
I mean, it's important for us to know. And so I think all those things again are the holistic approach. Which I mean, again, I think the more data you can gather, the better off you are. Doesn't mean you'll use it all. I mean, sometimes when I use Catapult, I use like 3 metrics out of the 2,000 metrics they pop out of that thing, whatever the hell it is. I got some absurd number. I look back, Marcelo, and I think about, what is it you can do? And again, you're better to light a candle than to sit in darkness, right? So if you say, well, I'm not going to test a vertical jump because the vertec only goes every half inch, well, then you're losing out because it still tells you something. I mean, if you talk to really good scientists, really good physiologists about testing and gathering important information, they will tell you if you run the Cooper 6-minute run enough, it's going to tell you something. Now, is it the best test? Well, it might be, like the situation you talked about: finances, space, numbers, resources, human resources. You only have one coach, you got 50 kids, whatever. But you got to take something in there, right? And I think the vertical jump is likely the most underrated piece. I mean, the vertical jump gives you tons of physiological information and performance information too, right? It showed us a 5-yard, 10-yard sprint. You don't need to run all over the place and hook up tendo units to things and all that. I think those are important. But how much, again, when it comes time to use that data, do you have enough people to download it? Like you're talking about, they brought in more analysts, and in some cases you need more analysts, right? But here's what happens. People are hiring more analysts. People are hiring more practitioners. But what they're not doing is having a conductor of that orchestra. So now, instead of having one analyst that tells you this is what I think, now you got 6, right? Instead of having one strength coach, you got 4. And so it's just it's kind of a conundrum. It's like going out to the beach. If you've ever surfed or bodyboard, you get in that rinse cycle, which is in between the wave and the beach. You can't get out of it. You're in the right medium, you got the right tool, but you can't do anything.
Yeah. But the one thing that I think you bring up a really good point, like I've seen it and you've been a part of it, is, I've sold systems in where like, oh, we want the data, but then the downloading process was like 3 hours, and it's like, it's gotten much better now. Obviously, you brought up Catapult. There are systems now that can just, that are web-based, that share information. Your name actually came up actually in one of my previous podcasts with Valor Mechanics, and I think they said it as well in that the community is still learning to trust in a technology. But to your point, it's like they can get paralysis by analysis because they're not either it's not structured data, even though it's structured, they can't understand it, or they look at it and say, no, I'm not seeing that. I see my athlete in a different way. So I think the biggest struggle that I still think from the strength and conditioning community is how do you address that in a program how do you reframe that in a program? Because obviously you've probably entered environments where you've had to transition them. How do you reframe? How do you change that aspect of training and performance?
There's only one reframe, and that's to understand the information, right? I mean, you gotta do the math. You just got to sit down and crank it out, and then you have to apply it. So, this goes out even farther. I tell people, if you want to be adopted into the soccer community, you better speak soccer. And if you can't speak soccer unless you understand soccer. So understanding the sport helps you deliver your system a lot easier than you just the strength guy. What was the biggest hurdle in the evolution of strength and conditioning in the late 70s, early 80s with getting them to work with other teams? Well, the hurdle was they were football guys. And everybody was thinking, hey, well, I want my guy to jump as high or my girl to jump as high as that and run as fast as that and put on extra muscle and blah, blah, blah. But then in the end, it became, well, I don't want that. I don't want my athletes to train like a football player, right? They're going to train me like a football player, and they would. That's what they were doing. Well, now we know better, right? And so the whole idea there is, what you got to understand the sport, all right? So when you understand the sport, then you understand the data. But if you can understand the math, that's difficult enough at some point. But I just really like z-scores and standard deviations, right? But you can throw an average in there. An average is part of that, the mean anyway. So okay, now you have that number. Now, if you don't know the sport, then you can't apply it to the context of a match or practice, right? That's the problem. So you need to. Here's what these companies don't do. They don't have that person that comes in there. That's why I've approached some companies with the athlete, like you're selling these to strength and conditioning coaches, to performance practitioners, but you don't have anybody on your staff who's a performance practitioner. They're all salesmen. So you don't speak that. Let me go in there and be the interpreter. I speak the tech and I speak coaching. You don't. And so when you make the phone call, it's just, oh, this guy's going to sell me stuff. But when I make the phone call, it's, hey, coach, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing good. Hey, listen, man, I got this thing here, Valor. I think it's a pretty good deal. It's got mobility to it. It's got utility to it. You can do it on your phone, and it gives you perfect baseline data. And you can pull it out anytime. Hey, it looks like Marcelo's limping. You guys gotta film him running here. Let's put it up there and see, like, wow, he's favoring the right side. Immediate intervention right there. So that's the other thing. Oh, I understand the data, the z-scores and all that. Okay. And what does that say? It says that he's or she is below average in vertical jump. Okay. What's the intervention? And so that's the other part. How do you intervene? What is the intervention? You got the data, you got the math, you got the results right here. It tells you exactly where the deficits are and the strengths. Now, what's your intervention? And I'm not sure everybody knows how to do that either. So that's what we're seeing. Again, it has nothing to do with the tech. Isn't that odd? It has nothing to do with the tech. It's still performance practitioner based.
It's kind of funny. That's kind of been my career. That's how I got involved in the vendor side of the business, is because I was a subject matter expert. I applied all the heart rate data. I applied all the wearable device data. I applied all the motion sensor data. And it was me putting on my hat of, if I had a roster of 28 athletes, how am I going to manage them? How am I going to get this information? And then
Right.
how am I going to communicate it in a meaningful way?
Right.
So, we've really talked about several topics. And what I think would really kind of put this all together for us is, what are some things that you're focused on now and that you would want to share with the community, as far as maybe some other things to get, if they wanted to know more about you, where they can go? Is there something that you want to share as far as an event or speaking an opportunity that you can be doing in the future? Because I know you do many of them. So I want to give you that moment to kind of share with the rest of the community.
Well, I'm just doing a bunch of consulting, just kind of like you, trying to get out there and spread the good word and really promote the high performance model, so that strength and conditioning coaches who feel like they want to have a bigger, wider reach than that one team, and be able to coach coaches, the coach teams, and then be able to handle every piece of the pie that enables this athlete to be healthy and perform better. But other than that, I'm on Twitter at Coach Alejo, Coach_Alejo. I'm on LinkedIn, and
You have
I'm just,
several articles that you've written too with Simply Faster.
well, I have a huge catalog there, and to name them all, I think I have 10 or 12 on there. I'm rewriting how to fix strength and conditioning, because I think one of the ways to fix strength and conditioning is to be in a leadership role that covers the performance. And, I think that's the thing. If you look back at some of these instances where systems aren't working, practitioners, certainly, I wouldn't dismiss the their pieces of dysfunction. But in the end, it's all about leadership. You have somebody who's a person over you. If that person's doing a bad job, who hired them? This person. Okay. What are we getting out of that? Right. And so that's really the key. I've really got nothing else going on other than that. And if anybody needs to get in touch with me, I'm always able to help. I'm fortunately in a position of being in to help others now. And, I can offer you my advice and tell you my experience, and hopefully that can help you.
I hope I hope other coaches that are coming up take advantage of that. I think I could speak for it. I honestly felt that the NSCA has done a good job at bringing in a lot of the professionals in the space to be able to engage with professionals like you and some of the researchers. I'm happy to see and promote it. Very proud of the organization. I feel that coaches like you have a lot to contribute. So I definitely would love to have you back on in the future and talk
How
about.
about tomorrow? I got so many messages, man. I got 40 something years built up in me. I'm ready for you, Marcelo.
No, I think there's a lot that you can get. I think that's what I enjoy about doing this is there's so much because I know in talking to so many professionals and so like from business owners and operators to strength and conditioning coaches, chief research officers, when it comes to the data, I think the uniqueness of being able to see it from the years of 2000 where we didn't have back then it was y 2.0 like 2000 it's like everything was going to break and
Wow, remember that?
yeah, and then like Google wasn't even around, smartphones weren't around, so we saw a lot of change, and I just expected this community to just kind of take like a massive leap forward. But I just felt like there was not open adoption, partially because of dogma and how people carry their programs. The other part was money. And then the other part was it's almost like a lemur mentality. It's like, well, if that coach is using this, they're going to get that and they didn't ask the right questions. Not all of them, but the ones that did do it right, coaches like you, Al Vermeil, even
Thank you.
Morris, like these coaches that all have, Coach Boyle has, even in his like the most surly of all coaches, I call him. He's the most surly that I've, because if you catch him on a bad day, he's going to let you know, but he's very brutally honest. And I think what's great about like coaches, like all you coaches is that it has to be an applied proof that it's actually been done because you could pretty much do the bullshit test on that individual and say, yeah, that's not going to work because it's an engineer driven perspective, right? It's an engineer that says, well, I built it, so they're just going to come.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
That's the other dilemma that this all brings together. So, I really enjoyed the conversation. I really want to thank you for taking the time to join me on here. And I definitely feel like I would love to bring you back on to actually talk about your rewrite of that article once it's released and kind of share with the community that, it's a perfect, if people take the time to read that article, I'll make sure to get the link from you and post it in the comments. But to see the changes in what you're seeing now, your perspective, because I think that's research that I think people need to understand and be able to gather that information because research happens between the four walls. And I think that now we have technology that's going to make it decentralized. And that's where a coach really can contribute. And that's where I think even the physical therapists, medical doctors, personal trainers could all contribute because we can collect data now in many different ways.
Right.
What will that do? What insight will that create?
Right. All right, buddy. Well, listen, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And well, I'm not one of those dudes that says, give me a call.